Hello again, classes. It's Mrs. T. I'm still having to be out of state instead of in a regular classroom this week. So this is your second of 3 short videos that you're going to watch this week so that we can continue learning about sociology. We're learning about culture right now. We're at the tail end of chapter 2. This will be the third lecture that talks about chapter 2's content, and we are going to branch over into chapter 3 today also. So I said this is the second of 3 videos for this week. It might be the second of 4 videos for this week. I'm going to see how far I get with the content here and examples and things before I can tell whether you're going to have more. You're going to have 1 or 2 left for this week. Now, I announced already to all of the classes that just like the calendar on our syllabus says, this is week 4, and so you're going to have the first of 4 tests this week. It's a multiple choice test this time around. 2 of your 4 tests are going to be multiple choice, and this one's one of them. And it's very much a learning experience, just like the lectures are a learning experience. And so these questions go along in order from chapter 1, 2, and 3, and you have as many times to log in and log out and answer them, and before the submission due date. But watch for an announcement tomorrow. That is Wednesday of this week. Watch for an announcement tomorrow that test is available to you, and it will be due, I believe, I'm not looking at the calendar at the moment, but it will be due September 17th. I believe that's Tuesday of next week, and you will submit that whether you are my online student or whether you are my face-to-face student watching me right now. All of you will submit it through Blackboard. So make sure that there are no surprises. I've sent an announcement out about that, and I think this is the second video that I've mentioned that announcement, or mentioned that fact about that test. So it's coming up, and you need to make sure you schedule some time so you can be successful. I promise you, you can be successful if you schedule some time to do it bit by bit, or if you are the type you want to do it all in one sit down, great. Pour yourself some sweet tea and get after it. And you can do it all in one sitting, whatever you decide, but you'll have about 7 days, 6 or 7 days to complete that test. Okay, so we're going to finish up with the culture chapter, chapter 2, today. There's probably another 20 minutes or so that we need to chat about culture and the content of just basic sociology knowledge about what culture is. You should think of culture as sort of the binder that holds all of the different categories of people in society together. You've already got in your notes that culture has a long list of things in its definition, from knowledge and ideas and beliefs and customs, traditions, right? You can find it in your notes and see all of the different things in a list. We've got material items that are specific to culture. One thing that I usually use as an example for material items that are specific to a culture are chopsticks versus a fork and a knife. I have a friend from Taiwan, and she picks up chopsticks. She has these huge cooking chopsticks. I think I told some of y'all about it. They're 5 times bigger than the kind of chopsticks that you get at the sushi counter in Kroger, and she cooks with these things, whereas I maybe would take like some tongs, or maybe I would take a huge spatula, or maybe I would take a fork and pull something up, a big roast or something that I'm gonna slice. She'll pick it up with these huge chopsticks. I would be an epic fail if I tried to do that with her great big cooking chopsticks, because I haven't had those things in my hand since I was born and old enough to hold something, whereas her parents put those things in her hand, and so those are part of her culture that she's extremely familiar with, and a knife and a fork are part of my culture that I'm extremely familiar with. So there's lots of examples of material culture that's specific to a place, or that is specific to a time. And so that's an important fact about culture that we've mentioned before. Even though culture has all of these things in common from one place to the next, culture, the definition never changes. It's always knowledge, ideas, rituals, norms, values, material culture, all of those things in that long list that people in a region share and pass from one generation to the next. The ideas, the knowledge, the actual items that are part of material culture, those things change from one place to the next. And those things change over time. Just talk to your mom and your dad or your grandma and your grandpa and ask them what life was like for them when they were 20 or however old you are right now. And they will tell you some major differences in the way they thought, in their outlook on the world, what the norms were for dating or dressing or working or any of those kinds of things. You can see that culture changes over time and it changes from place to place. So that's why 2 lectures ago we started this whole conversation about culture with talking about a concept called ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is the tendency to judge other people or other entire cultures or societies based on our own individuality or based on our culture's way, our society's way of doing things. It's a tendency that everyone has. We learn, sort of. We're going to talk about the learning process of culture in chapter 3. But we learn to think of the things that we do and say and feel and eat and see around us every day. We think of those things as, look at my air quotes here, normal. So when I say the word normal, it always has air quotes around it if you are looking at me, or I will indicate that it has air quotes around it. If you're reading the captions, you can know that I'm emphasizing it that way. Because what the heck does normal mean? I mean, I challenge you to come up with a definition that's going to fit every situation around the planet, yet if you asked that person that you thought was the strangest person ever and something that you would never consider to be normal, they probably think the same way about you, that you're the strangest person ever and they're the normal ones. So, it's a tricky question. And this ethnocentrism thing is this tendency for us to judge others. And when I say judge, you don't have to have a harsh judgment. Maybe you're judging them favorably in comparison to you. But the judgment part is where ethnocentrism comes in. And more often than not, in my experience, instead of judging people favorably in comparison to yourself, I've noticed that many times the judgment is negative in relation to yourself, unfavorable judgment. And that's what can be hard about becoming and learning about sociology and anthropology also, because I have similar conversations with my anthropology students when we talk about ethnocentrism. Because culture is different from place to place, because culture changes over time, we're going to encounter many different ways of life when we begin to study societies around the world. Some societies around the world are very homogeneous, meaning everyone in the society across the population shares. Remember, sharing is an important part of the culture definition. Everyone in a homogeneous society shares relatively the same norms, folkways, mores, and laws. They hold those same values dear, those same norms dear, beliefs dear, and they consider them to be true. So homogeneous societies are like that. But our society in the United States, we have tons of different subcultures, to use a term from chapter 2. Because even though we have a United States culture, some of us will say American culture, I am shying away from saying American culture these days because from Canada to Argentina and everything in between is America. So in the United States, when I say United States culture, think about all the different subcategories of culture that exist within the overarching United States, the United States classification of culture. So there's a term in chapter 2 called a subculture. And in order to understand that definition, you have to go back to a previous definition that we've learned, the term category of people. So a category of people, just to review, is a huge number of people across the population that share similar social characteristics, similar lifestyles, similar interests. They're spread out across the population, but they have a lot in common simply because of maybe their age group or their religious belief system or their racial category, their gender makeup, their et cetera, et cetera. Those are the social categories that we're talking about. I think it was lesson 3 in sociology when we first talked about what a category of people actually is. So you can go back and review that lecture if this does not sound familiar to you. It should. Okay, so a subculture, we start out by saying that a subculture is a category of people within a larger society or a larger culture such as the United States, and that subculture shares certain characteristics that it sets them apart enough from the rest of society that they are thought of as a category of people all themselves, but they're still part of the larger society. So if we have norms, which is made up of folkways, mores, and laws, those 3 types of norms, United States, we can say that the United States has a certain idea of what folkways, mores, and laws are. Okay? Values also. So across the United States, we can say that we have core values that are part of United States culture. You can read about those in chapter 2. There's a list of core values that this author put together to suggest that we have all those things in common as citizens or residents of the United States. But a subculture has certain differences that can be noted about those standard set of values or about in general, the norms for living that are considered to be dominant in a society. In a society like the United States, subcultures are everywhere. Sometimes we use an example. Well, when I'm in a classroom and I ask a question, can, for instance, someone give me an example of a subculture? Since we are in the South, since we're in the Bible Belt, I constantly get the following as an example that students give me. Well, are people in the North a separate subculture from people in the South? And so you tell me. Let's look at lifestyles. Let's look at language, for instance. Language, we know, is one of the key components of the definition of culture. And when we say language, remember, we emphasized that language is a set of symbols, but it's made up of more than just words. It's made up of body language, all kinds of communication patterns. So when we think of people in the North and people in the South of the United States, are there different language patterns that apply? When you hear someone speaking, can you sort of tell that they are from a certain region of the country or another? And if the answer is yes, then maybe we're onto something here, with Northerners and Southerners being different subcultures of people. Are there different cooking styles and other folk ways, for instance, that are different from the North to the South? Are there differences in the kinds of vehicles that we drive, or whether we have a vehicle to begin with or use more public transportation, or those different kinds of just daily customs and traditions that we engage in from one region of the country to the next? Or we could look at East Coast, West Coast, right? And look at the differences in daily life and customs, folkways, maybe mores too. Certainly laws are different from one region of the country to the next, state to state, for instance. So subcultures of people can be made up of lots of different social characteristics that group them together, and people in a subculture, the number of people in a subculture is far too many for everyone to know each other. We're not suggesting that, because remember, we're using the word category of people to be a huge number of people spread out across the population, and they happen to share social characteristics. Well, a subculture is a category of people. Therefore, it's a huge number of people spread out across a population, and the social characteristics that they have in common are those items, at least some of those items in the list of our definition of culture. So, because there are so many different subcultures in the United States, And because we ourselves definitely came from a particular category of people, we might have ethnocentrism about people who live next door to us. Because maybe the people who live next door to us are from a different subculture, and so they're just weird or something. And that reaction is, or I'm suspicious, or some kind of reaction like that, might be an ethnocentric response to differences in subculture. In sociology, however, we study society and human interaction. And if society is made up of lots of different people from lots of different subcultures, then guess who we're studying? All of them. And we have to be really careful about our tendency to judge others based on the subculture or the culture that we ourselves come from, because it will give us biased or slanted information. It will give us unreliable conclusions when we look at the systematic data that we collect when we study society and human interaction. So we have to be very careful about that. Okay, so where does our culture come from? Well, our culture comes from previous generations. Let's look at the definition of culture itself. At the end of the definition, it says that people in a population share all of those things in the list. Not only do they share them in one snapshot in time, but as new members of society are being born, the people who are raising, or rearing is the proper word to use for a human being. You rear a human child and you raise goats, for instance, or farm animals. So the people who are reared as the next generation in a society learn their ways from a number of sources. And so that is how we pass culture from one generation to the next. And it's also how culture changes over time. Because they don't just learn, those new young people don't just learn a carbon copy image, if y'all even know what carbon copy is anymore, the carbon paper we used to have to use to make copies of things. We don't just learn a carbon copy image of the way our parents did things, right? Can I get an amen and hallelujah? Thank you. We don't learn the same exact way of life that our parents had. We learn it to a certain extent with changes that make it sort of belong to our own generation. And when it's our generation's turn to rear a new generation, that new generation has another identity also. It's still part of the same culture. We've shared our culture from one generation to the next and passed it on, so it continues into the future. But we learn our culture. A functionalist, remember our functionalist perspectives, a functionalist who thinks of society as a machine that is stable and orderly, and when changes happen, they happen slow and gradual. A functionalist would say that society is the glue that holds, culture. Culture is the glue that holds society, the people in a society, together over time. And that those slow changes are part of the system that enable each generation to have its own identity. So its culture works for the stability and order of, and the works toward balance, ever more balanced society and culture moving forward. That's the way a functionalist would analyze culture in general on the most macro level sense. But that's not the only way. That's not the only perspective that we can use to analyze culture. Conflict theory is another one of our sociological perspectives. You can flip back in your notes, but let me remind you that conflict here is about struggle for power, control, struggle for what we call social resources. We're going to be talking about social resources a lot, especially when we get to chapter 7 about social inequality in our sociology class. But social resources like rights and privileges, access to wealth, access to services, access to political voice and opinion, those kinds of things are social resources, in addition to raw materials or labor and money-making opportunities that exist in society. So conflict theorists say there are categories of people in society called the haves, and there's a category of people in society called the have-nots. And the conflict comes because the haves are usually advantaged by the structure of society on the macro scale, whereas the have-nots are disadvantaged by the structure of society on the macro scale. A conflict theorist, therefore, would say that if we pass culture from one generation to the next, and we're passing essentially a broken culture because culture has within it inequality between the haves and the have-nots, then all we're doing is we're continuing the haves and the have-nots for future generations. So culture is broken and needs to be changed because inequality is not fair and we need to fix it. And sure, fixing it one step at a time is great for a conflict theorist, but better would be a complete and total revamp, and we can move forward and not be unequal to each other in the variety of ways that people are unequal to each other according to our culture. Because those definitions of inequality exist in our culture, according to a conflict theorist. So we need to fix those definitions of inequality, get rid of them altogether, and then we will have much more peace and tranquility, and then we can be in balance. So a conflict theorist and a functionalist would look at the culture on the macro scale in a very different way, right? We're looking at inequality here, and that's the core of culture, and if we're passing this unequal core of culture from one generation to the next, you're not fixing anything. You're keeping the trouble from, keeping on going into the future. A functionalist would say society has to move forward, and this is the framework that we have, and this framework has built up around other pieces that pre-existed certain issues. Crime pre-existed the criminal justice system, but now the criminal justice system is enormous and it's a moneymaker, and it generates, huge amounts of money being exchanged in our economic system, and so all that's connected, and so that's part of our culture, and so we move forward for stability. So we have, different ways to analyze these kinds of things according to sociology. With symbolic interactionism, which is our third most common perspective to use, with symbolic interactionism, we look at the micro level. We look at the way symbols affect the way that we create reality and the meaning that we have in life and our communication processes. We look at the patterns of interaction, symbolic interactionism. We look at patterns of interaction between people and how those around you, someone who is observing you, a young person or an old person or a person in the similar age group, anyone observing you can learn behavioral patterns and can adopt behavioral patterns from what they see in you. And then culture is sort of this shared thing on the micro scale where we create reality and have a reflection within our daily behavior and our daily interaction. We have a reflection of larger macro scale social institutions and social patterns in our daily lives. And that's how we pass from one generation to the next. So this is a complicated chapter, but in my opinion, fascinating. And it is really the root, after we learn in general what the sociological imagination is from chapter 1, social facts, the sociological perspectives, all of those things that we need to take with us from chapter 1 into the rest of this semester. Chapter 2 is all about culture, and it is the single most important aspect of the society and human interaction that you're going to be systematically studying as a sociologist. So understanding what culture is and where it comes from and how we pass it from one generation to the next, and how subcultures are different categories of people within a larger society. These things are going to really help you work toward your value-free sociology judgments. I don't expect you to be perfect with being value-free. Please don't expect me to be perfect with being value free, but I have a lot more practice than you do. And so if in feedback from a paper or from the Safe Haven Baby Box activity that we have just had, if you have noticed that my feedback for some of that is you are looking at, maybe my feedback is you're looking at this from a certain point of view, and have you thought about it from this point of view? I am trying to steer you toward getting out of that tendency to use ourselves and our ideas and beliefs and emotions and all of the things that we shouldn't let control us when we're practicing being value free. I'm trying to steer you away from that so that you can see life from somebody else's shoes. And that's, when you're able to start doing that, that's when you're on the road to value-free sociology. It's not easy, folks. Culture is different from place to place, and sometimes it's super different, and we're not prepared for it because we just never fathomed that someone could, or a group of people, a number of people in a population could behave in a certain way. We've never considered that was an option for human behavior in some cases. So this is an important concept to understand, to try to be able to objectively accept some of the data that has been collected that we're going to look at moving forward, and also objectively analyze certain sets of data by using the 3 different perspectives, like we're going to have practice doing this semester. So thank you for your attention here, and I hope that you learned a lot, and I hope that you will text me and ask me questions if you have them. And I can tell already by where I'm stopping with this video, I can tell already that there's going to be 2 more videos this week, and not just this one, but the 2 remaining videos this week are only going to be about this long, each of them. So please give yourself enough time to watch them, sit down and watch them and take some notes, stop me in mid-sentence, rewind, so you can write down a concise definition of subculture, for instance, from this lecture, or you have enough time to flip back and review a definition of ethnocentrism, for instance, from a previous lesson. So when you hear these buzzwords that I keep on repeating over and over again, I promise you it's not just because I like to hear myself talk. It's because these are the key concepts that are working toward our 4 course learning outcomes, and also that critical reasoning, that general education learning outcome in general called critical reasoning, that is so central to the reason this class is on your degree plan. Study hard. I'm counting on you. See you soon.